I can't remember precisely how I came to discover or even know of Oswald-Spengler around, I don't know, age 18 or 19 in Montreal, Canada, where he wasn't exactly part of the culture, but I found his work very consonant with my interest in the different mentalities that have shaped different cultures over the world, the historicity and the different worlds that the major world cultures are on their own, and that's what the part of his work that I like. Yeah. Around the age of 18 or 19, I'd got my hands on this very same volume, that I was reading it as I began my university studies in history, and somehow I experienced a profound consonance between the issues raised by Spengler and the new French, or even in this case, the professor involved was not even French, but the new history of mentalities that was emerging at that time, and that was part of a kind of private seminar and about those ideas at the time. And in my mind, there was always a back and forth between my categories from Spengler and the new investigations of the time. And I guess I've mulled over these issues of how civilizations come to have the characters and the outlooks that they do for all that time. And although I sort of moved on from Spengler over those decades, dealing with some other thinkers that I'm going to mention today, I really relished the opportunity to come back to my first love of Spengler. Actually, I could even mention that at the time I even went so far as to try to get admitted to Harvard on the basis of a proposal of research on Oswald Spengler and in his morphology, and comparing probably to the history of mentalities. Well, I'll let you imagine how far I got with that. So in view of that, I will give my thoughts on these matters right now, starting with a famous quote as to encapsulate them. "Out of this nettle danger, I pluck this flower safety." I would contend that this Shakespeare quote, made infamous by Neville Chamberlain as he took credit for the Munich Accord with Hitler 80 years ago this month, neatly captures the dialectic out of which Faustian culture was born, which I take for granted here. The category of Spengler's categories of Faustian and Magian. I just have kind of alternative interpretations of how these entities have arisen, which I want to explore by drawing on other thinkers. So yes, so this quotation is in a sense explicated by this other quote by the Romanian historian Lucian Boia, who is the author of a very stimulating book on the West and a historical interpretation, who says that the two faces of there are two faces of the West, which was undermined by its weaknesses and terrified by 1,000 real or imagined aggressions as it arose around the year 1000. But as always aspired to surpass itself and to overcome its shortcomings from the very beginning. So at that beginning, 1,000 years ago, the sense of threat from life's inherent uncontrollability fuels an urge to get it under control and remains tied to Faustian culture's very success, to the point of turning into a need to seek out new challenges with a view to ultimate control, whose very elusiveness makes it as alluring as a mirage, turning into a self-reinforcing addiction that converts everything into the raw material which Faustian dreams are made of. Hence the chivalric cult of adventure, as it soon translated into the rationale of venture capitalism. It's not by coincidence that I used the same name, and actually Mikhail Nerlich has devoted a survey of the ideology of adventure over Western history in the 1980s, I believe. So yes, venture capitalism, trading in securities, I underline this word, even as it manages risks, with the entire globe as both a stage and capital for its own unfolding on new frontiers. Oswald-Spengler located the source of this Faustian drive in the predatory instincts of seafaring pirates from the north. But this explanation falls short if we recall how much, with the significant exception of the Vikings, of course, European man actually dreaded the sea as the embodiment of, as Lucian Boya puts it, absolute insecurity, a chaos of unpredictability and peril, until southern European adventurers overcame their fear and by increments of technical mastery of that unruly element, transmuted it into the medium of a risk-taking confidence buoyed by both crusading zeal for souls to save and the lure of material resources to secure, on a horizon of global mastery that conjured up uncertainty as a challenge to overcome, and yet to be sought ever further afield in the infinite recess of firm grasp over all things. If northern sea peoples were often at the cutting edge of the defining enterprises of Faustian culture, it was, however, as natural agents of a new kind of imperial impulse from the old Roman center, whereby the peripheral backwardness of Western Christendom at its beginnings gave rise to a methodical frontier spirit which turned this handicap into an insuperable advantage and eventually a global pandemic of the soul. An admiring but critical reader of The Decline of the West, Protestant thinker and polymath Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who was mentioned this morning, made this point in answering this book's pagan pessimism with Christian radicalism and its what sounds like racial essentialism with an existential phenomenology of culturally embodied space and time. Rosenstock maintained that European peoples of the second millennium answered with ever more material calls to salvation the spiritual appeals of the first millennium church. The end result of this consciously historical process, since the world wars as ultimate world revolution of total mobilization, was to be found in the global ecumenical economy of mankind throughout the natural expanse of the actual planet as the horizon of the third millennium, in contrast to previous empires that were but cultural worlds unto themselves, each in their own region and time span, as Spengler morphologically describes them. Also Lucian Boya could thus describe Christianity as Western Christianity as this unique drive to unify the world and bring about the end of time, both as apocalyptic terror and as millennial utopia. This is the constant theme of the Western, initially Christian experience. As heirs to the Magian world of early Christianity that lives on in Eastern churches, actually, Orthodox thinkers like Christos Yannaras are keenly aware that this world historical development that overwhelms their own cultures as all others is the outcome of Christianity's Western pseudomorphosis, as Spengler puts it. They thus bring important insights on the latter's process, since the genesis of Faustian culture exactly coincides with the great schism of a breakaway Roman church from the four other ancient patriarchates of the East. Yannaras shares with Rosenstock-Huessy the insight that the systematic conquest of space owes much to the challenge facing the West's newly converted barbarian tribes in using the church to help impose civilized order as borrowed from Rome on their unruly frontier empire in the far west of continental Europe. For Rosenstock-Huessy rightly identifies the Orthodox Church as just what she also feels herself to be, that is, none other than the unreconstructed ancient church of the first millennium, whose paramount concern is to remain in communion with this time of unity as defined through its 7 ecumenical councils, So it may be said that in contrast to orthodoxy's temporal qualitative definition in comprehension as orally transmitted living truth, Roman Catholicism came to define itself in quantitative terms of spatial extension as a jurisdiction by its literal universal claim to direct authority over the earth as the seat of a centrally dictated magisterium and the divine mandate to consummate this totalizing unity. This Western bias towards space initially coincided with a new visual emphasis, whereas the Eastern bias toward time has remained a function of an acoustic emphasis. This contrast is a central finding of the Toronto School of Communication Studies and was articulated at mid-century by Harold Innis in his book Empire and Communication. It was Innis's conviction that stable societies were able to achieve a balance between time and space-biased communications media. In his writing, Innis is forthright in his own bias that the oral tradition, based as it is on taking the time for personal transmission, is inherently more flexible and humanistic than the written tradition, which he found rigid and impersonal in contrast. Harold Innis held up both classical Greece and Byzantium as unique examples of balance between oral and written culture, while for Marshall McLuhan, the most famous member, of course, of the Toronto School, the Eastern Church, being iconic and odile tactile, could not tolerate the visual hierarchy of Rome with external materialistic aspects, later bolstered by the Counter-Reformation's emphasis on print-based centralized bureaucracy, but which came into its own in rival movements from the Reformation and the Enlightenment to Positivism and Marxism. As Christos Yannaras says, those differences, which during the 11th century led to the schism between Christian East and West, are the same ones that caused Western Christianity to give birth to the preconditions for historical materialism. As a result of that medieval Western, quote-unquote, cultural underdevelopment, which always put forth its instinctive psychological need to fortify and secure the individual with irrefutable convictions and documented moral worthiness, manifest from the invention of purgatory to its Protestant substitution with predestination, the West converted the ecclesial experience into ideology, according to Yannaras, i.e. into a set of reassuring convictions, bolstering the insecure individual's subjective faith, initially in the face of divine judgment on a condemned, fearful world. We're talking about the world before the year 1000 and some time after. But eventually to realize the concomitant promise of godlike power over the world if that challenge was met. This is why, as Spengler puts it, in the ethics of the West, everything is direction, claim to power, will to affect the distant being really the province of the visual. Here, Luther is completely at one with Nietzsche, popes with Darwinians, socialists with Jesuits. For one and all, the beginnings of morals is a claim to general and permanent validity, just as Yannaras suggests, the idea of something completely objectively dependable out there to hang on to. It is a necessity of the Faustian soul that this should be so. Even our monasticism, Spengler says, with its Templars, Franciscans, Dominicans, and the rest, takes shape as an order movement, in sharp contrast to the ascesis of the early Christian hermit. It is quite wrong to bind up Christianity with the moral imperative. It was not Christianity that transformed Faustian man, but Faustian man who transformed Christianity. And he not only made it a new religion, which the Christian East could no longer recognize from its ancient roots in the Magian world, but also gave it a new moral direction. The Magian it became the Faustian I, the passion-charged center of the world, the foundation of the great sacrament of personal contrition. Will to power, even in ethics, the passionate striving to set up a proper morals as a universal truth and to enforce it upon humanity, to reinterpret or overcome or destroy everything otherwise constituted, nothing is more characteristically our own than this is, says Spengler. The ideological hardening and drive that gives the insecure individual something to hold on to in objective institutions like the modern state and concrete objects like those of technique, also arms him for the overcoming of all the uncertainty of space and time, and becomes the fulcrum for the methodical conquest by Western man. It takes place with the advent of the Roman Catholic Church, centered on the universal claims of the unique figure of the Pope, emblematic of a number of convergent developments that came to a head precisely when the year 1000 loomed terrifyingly as certain doom, but came and went to leave in its wake a bold confidence that destiny could be mastered after all, as evidenced by the mantle of churches that promptly covered Western Europe, as the chronicler Raoul Glaber witnessed in the midst of the medieval technological revolution that coincided with the Gregorian Reformation. Just as St. Anselm of Canterbury simultaneously laid the groundwork for both scholasticism and the satisfaction theory of atonement as debt settlement out of the Church's treasury of merits, to which she held the keys. This made grace into a vital resource to be tapped or withheld at will by the institutional holder of its monopoly, much as oil has become today. Someone controlled the tap to that one resource on which everything depends. So its power lay in its applicability to penance as a kind of credit that redeemed the debt of sin on the basis of their detailed tarification in the penitential books used by confessors. This quantification offered a way to mitigate fear of torments in the hereafter once they had been assigned to individual accounts in the finite but extensive temporality of purgatory as a place where sinners were purified by fire and other appropriate chastisements for periods that could be precisely quantified and therefore acted upon. For their terms could be reduced by penances, intercessions, indulgences that were traded and eventually monetized through various spiritual credit instruments. According to Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, this is where Western man discovered to his great relief that he had an individual destiny extending in historical time to an immanentized eschatological horizon and which he could act upon to relieve his burdens and ultimately reach happiness in a very concrete way. What was true of the beyond was easy to see in this world as well, for Christian writers since the Carolingian Renaissance had begun to present the development of mechanical arts, as they were called, as technology was called, necessitated by Europe's somewhat harsh environment and scattered settlement, as a way to gradually reverse the effects of the fall from Eden, understood as Adam's loss of that longed-for control over his environment, so that such fullness of control came to define the divine in whose image Western man expected to be restored, largely by his own labor. This would remain the constant theme of the religion of technology, whose uniquely Western Christian nature and unfolding David F. Noble has been able to trace from the High Middle Ages to this day, this fabulous book. Much as Spengler already did when he wrote in very similar terms in Man and Technics, but in the Faustian, and the Faustian alone, every theory is also from the outset a working hypothesis. A working hypothesis need not be correct. It is only required to be practical. Hence, to experiment, Bacon's Scientia Experimentalis, which is the interrogation of nature under torture with the rack, lever, and screw, on the model of the Inquisition. Already in the 10th century, we meet with technical constructions of a wholly new sort. Already the steam engine, the steamship, and the air machine are in the thoughts of Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, and many a monk busied himself in his cell with the idea of perpetual motion. It is the stratagem of intellectual beasts of prey. They imagined that their desire was to know God, and yet it was the forces of inorganic nature, the invisible energy manifested in all that happens, that they strove to isolate, to seize, and to turn to account. Account is the operative word here, for the assumption that reality can be altered and remade by an exercise of conscious will, methodically applied, really goes back to what Spengler called Western Christianity's Ursacrament of confession, a form of detailed accounting for oneself that makes sense in terms of the final reckoning of purgatory, where there was now room for regulated negotiation of outstanding debts and future rewards as tallied on a double ledger of pluses and minuses. But just as purgatory is at the root of both the balance sheets of capitalism and the energy budgets of thermodynamics, the confessional impulse has survived the sacrament and spread throughout what is known as culture and the arts in the West, as Spengler noted, especially wherever Protestantism suppressed its clerical outlet for personal accounts that have, as if in overcompensation, gradually devolved from moral self-justification to raw self-expression as sovereign authenticity. It has been argued that as forms of account, counting and narrating are closely linked activities, arising from a primal tactile experience of numbers as the child counts on his fingers and uses their solid difference to rhythmically structure what he recounts as a sequence, as in children's rhymes known in French as comptine. One could also relate the Dutch verb tellen for counting to English in telling a tale. Inserting things within a numerical sequence puts them securely within our grasp, that of our counting fingers or digits, even more firmly since this bodily sensation is translated to an abstract plane impervious to outside contingencies. If quantity is at base a tactile concept, it could only become the universal standard of the real once certain concentrated forms of the tactile were dislocated from their common ground with acoustic percepts of whole body involvement in preliterate oral cultures and got attached instead to the distancing, surveying gaze of a literate culture on its way to visual primacy with the advent of print. Numerals stabilized in standard Arabic shapes as scriptural modernity were instrumental in the mutation from a tactile to a visual conceptualization of the world that made it easy to hold under control at a safe remove from direct involvement. Money, as the objectified concept of the palpable and securely holdable, facilitated the replacement of the world itself by representations as a pillar of modernity, the Midas touch whereby the fixed price bypassed involvement in the uncertainty of concrete interpersonal exchange embodied in haggling as the rule of non-Western cultures. As scholars Roncallo Dow and Uribe Youngblood have stated in a recent issue of the journal Utopia, numbers seem to provide the safety and reassurance we feel with a blanket or by sucking our thumbs as infants. Like parental figures, numbers don't lie. Yet, as numbers extend beyond our grasp, our society leaves behind the certainty of tactility usually associated with them. The changing numbers of oil prices, interest rates, and currency values mesmerize the modern priests of contemporary capitalistic and neoliberal enterprises, the economists. Thus, if McLuhan argued that we were moving beyond the number and reaching post-work, it was because we can no longer connect those elements to their essential tactility. They become figures of belief. Yet these digital objects of belief stand at the tail end of a 1,000-year process of etherealization and conceptual condensation of the sacred things that were the initial touchstone of Faustian man's life. Here I'll draw largely from quotations from Albert Mirgeler in his book Mutations of Western Christianity. It is no exaggeration to say that the devotion of the ordinary people in the Middle Ages was roused mainly by the cult of relics, the most essentially tactile form of religiosity. For in the more material Germanic world, relics meant precisely what in the more spiritual Byzantine world icons were intended to be, that part of heaven which was already present and perceptible on earth. In the largely unsettled landscape of Western Europe, where the conflation of spiritual and temporal power in the same persons often made sanctity hard to discern, its tangible objective presence in the relics could at least be accessed and grasped in physical proximity to particular saints whose miraculous remains were clung to as lifesavers in a sea of uncertainty. The main thing was to get one's hands on them by any means, even theft, as in the practice of furta sacra, sacred robbery, that even reached overseas to the Near East to secure the relics of St. Mark and St. Nicholas in daring raiding parties for the maritime city-states of Venice and Bari, respectively. The holy pirates, that was a creation of Western Christianity, which would have, I guess, a long legacy. The Crusades may also be seen in this light as a desperate need to physically lay hold of the holy places for the Roman Church, Whereas the liturgical ecclesiology of the Eastern churches, making the whole Christian cosmos magically present beyond time and space in every local celebration, hardly required literal possession of its historical foundations. Icons and their hieratic placement within Magian acoustic space were enough to fully manifest them in the act of the Eucharistic sacrifice of bread and wine as the body and blood of the Lord, a mystery participable by touch in the chemical senses of taste and smell, involved in their consumption by all the faithful. By contrast, communion under both species of the bread and wine was limited to the clergy by the Gregorian Reformation of the West, partly to avert the dreadful risk of consecrated substances coming in contact with facial hair and profaned as crumbs and spills. This lack of trust in the concrete act of transmission, out of concern for the independent integrity of the substances involved, is revealing of the same attitude that caused the shift from the context-dependent fragility of oral and scribal tradition in the early church and its orthodox continuation in favor of more secure, dependable channels of relaying information and authority by means of visually objectifiable conceptuality. Much as Gregorian chant and Roman liturgy were imposed by the papacy to replace a variety of local musical and liturgical traditions, it was in response to a variety of mutually conflicting canons and patristic quotations subject to local interpretive traditions that an attempt was made to impose on it a systematic control with the aid of conceptual distinctions and general headings. Here lies the origin of the new systematic philosophy of the schools, which clarified the basic concepts of the objectification of the church. For example, the real presence in the Eucharist, transubstantiation, the switching of divine substance for bread substance, that really thinking of objective substances, the priestly character, the objective efficacy of the sacrament, ex opere operato. Down-to-earth Aristotelian logic thus supplanted hitherto dominant Platonic Stoic thought as a conceptual structure for the mastery of concrete facts, worked out in terms of art or technique, technomorphos, as Mirkeler puts it, in parallel to the unprecedented celebration and development of the mechanical arts, as technology was first called by Scotus Erigena in Carolingian times, to subdue space and regulate it through the abstract numbers of clock time and the money economy. For if, during the first Christian millennium, technology and transcendence belonged to entirely different realms, this new Christianization of the arts for the first time gave the means of mortal survival a crucial role in the realization of immortal salvation. So they could be conflated and interchanged, and one could eventually replace the other in time. Now, the removal of the Eucharistic cup from the laity by the Gregorian Reformation out of fear for the physical integrity of its contents is probably at the root of the Grail legends that express longing for the unique power of the original relic that held Christ's blood, withdrawn to distant places beyond the horizon as the object of a personal quest modeled on specialized military religious orders. But a safe distance as a privileged mode of access to the most sacred object would also operate at much closer range in ordinary piety. The emphasis has shifted, according to Mirkeler, from the reception of the sacrament to its presence. I think Heidegger's critique of the metaphysics of presence has very real and very concrete origins in the mutations of the medieval liturgical practice. The fact that this continues, yes, that the presence of the real presence in the Eucharist continues as long as the sacrament is not consumed, rendered possible the Eucharistic piety, which created for itself in the course of the later Middle Ages suitable liturgical forms in the Feast of Corpus Christi, the procession of the Blessed Sacrament, the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, at first in the chalice and later visibly in the monstrance, and even in the Mass celebrated in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, instead of being a liturgy that is just an act that self-sufficient act to be performed. There's nothing to specifically gaze at. But in Western Christianity, almost stifled under the weight of relics, Christ had to be regained as the center and made visible. But for both miracle-working relics and the streamlined chalice or round wafer that outdid them in sacred objecthood, it was a question of phenomena escaping out of the given background of the liturgical action, where everything was drawn into the act of worship, and leading to an objectifying and materializing cult which set those who offered it at a distance from the sacred object and at least momentarily absorbed their self-consciousness, according to Mirgeler. It is here alone that the historical line can be perceived leading from the cult of relics to the prominence of the Eucharist in the Middle Ages. But I would suggest that the same line can be drawn in space from the Eucharist as glorified miraculous relic to the eye of the beholder as communicant, since according to certain scholars, the culmination of the late medieval Mass was the elevation of the consecrated bread so that it could be seen by the congregation, a practice introduced in the 13th century. The sight of the host, the touching of the body of Christ by the visual way of the worshipper, the idea was that the light came out of the eyeballs to touch things, was thought to have a salvific effect as a purer form of contact, less exposed to material contingency. As a form of touch, vision was thus the strongest possible access to the object of devotion, as Margaret Mills asserts. Therefore, the so-called spiritual communion was considered to be real communion, even superior to ingesting the host. At the same time, it was considered to be something like ingesting the host with the eyes. If not that, then at the very least touching the host with the eyes as one might with the hands. If to touch is immediately to be touched by what I touch, to experience one's own tangibility prior to any reflexivity, here was a form of touch that dispensed with the body's own tangibility and concentrated certainty at the other end of the eye's ray, in a more real presence than any evolving two-way bodily contact, without any of the gaps in space and time involved in messy physical interchange. That objective certainty, visually receding out there, became the touchstone of a subjective certainty that bracketed the situated body, even as it allowed one to lay hold from a distance of the unalloyed fullness of the collective and personal focus of attention, and thus of reality, reifying as divine this concentration on a single point in the distance. From this high point of Western man's experience of self and reality as objective presence in external visual space, it is not hard to see how it would spread beyond this religious matrix to gradually become the default template of the Faustian worldview in all contexts. For all sightlines could now be seen to converge on a single focus and make it possible to grasp and thus control at last without remainder, risk, or ambiguity any given object of perception or conceptualization, now interchangeable in the mind's eye, as the new common sense that replaced audile tactile insight within Spengler's Magian world cave with a fresh Faustian outlook on an objective world surveyed and controlled with more compelling certainty and unmatched operative power. Thus, according to art historian Bertrand Prévost, Renaissance perspective is really the demonstration of the projection of a viewpoint on a vanishing point. In it, the viewer's viewpoint is correlative of a vanishing point in space, which is far more complex than the simple illusion of a three-dimensional space that can be there in prehistoric art or in the art of many civilizations of antiquity, classical or not. When the point blank of the host's real presence as miraculously divine objective substance was replicated in the vanishing point of every horizon, it was now all of the real, graspable in principle somewhere else, that could be captured in a network of orthogonal lines connecting all possible dots in infinitely extended homogeneous visual space. This minutely quantifiable space, thus manipulable in every detail, became that of realistic representation as a compelling substitute for the life world. Renaissance perspective was indeed first experienced in churches, much as virtual reality is today, as strikingly more convincing and having more weight than physical reality, since it added to the precisionist hyperrealism of the spaces it framed the sense of a safe distance from outside their freeze-frame time, as in the bullet time that allows viewers to survey from all space dimensions Matrix movie characters fixed in slow motion in CGI special effects today. I see the continuity there somehow. That space divided up in endless permutations of square standard units is not only found in the Cartesian coordinates of pictorial representations, but appears almost simultaneously in the translation of the written word to movable alphabetic type, in the print medium that finally does away with the unreliability and rarity of error-prone, labor-intensive manuscripts as an aid to a still largely oral culture. The standardized certainty of print that defined the visual culture of the Gutenberg galaxy, according to Marshall McLuhan, also had a lot to do with its tactile nature as alphabet, related to that of numbers. For to hold a typesetted printed piece of one's own work in one's hand was a departure from the anonymity of scribal transmission. Elizabeth Eisenstein has maintained that the wish to see one's own work in print, fixed forever with one's name in card files and anthologies, is different from the desire to pen lines that could never be fixed in a permanent form, might be lost forever, altered by the copying, or, if truly memorable, be carried by oral transmission and be assigned ultimately to anon. The capability of the printing press to mass produce meant that these works would reach a much greater audience than it would have in a culture of scribes. This audience would need only to look at the front page of the book in order to learn the name of the author, whereas in manuscripts, you don't have it doesn't start with the title, you have a colophon at the end. This recognition consolidated the Western cult of personality as celebrity in a way that was not available nor possible in the age of scribes. Once the printing press arrived on the scene, however, suddenly there was a sense of standardization, uniformity, and fixity. Words became recognizable to their named author. Portraits were identified by their human counterpart and their artist, ensuring longed-for stability to their personality in a form of personal immortality that completed in this world the process initiated with purgatory around the turn of the millennium. What the printing press began, social media has completed. As they give a platform for individuals to self-promote on a worldwide level so that everyone is now a celebrity. By eliminating the element of space from her continuum, their user is promulgating a different reality, one that is grounded in discarnate abstract space rather than in time. Instead of experiencing the risk of genuine in-person positive or negative feedback in real time, that which is uncertain, she has chosen to interact with the certain, the likes, rather than the uncertain but genuine human emotional feedback. Like purgatory at the roots of Faustian man, the web holds the key to a quantifiable treasury of merits and hits as binary units of generic approval, saving the narcissistic subject from the outer darkness of objective social non-existence. Thus, if Faustian patterns show no sign of abating in the neo-acoustic electric environment of the global village, their projective relation to space as infinite reserve really can be traced to a uniquely Western visual tactile paradigm incipient in the translation of Christianity to the European landscape, and now contagiously spread worldwide within the mentality bred by technological society. A line can therefore be drawn from the real presence of the Eucharist as touched by sight from a safe distance to television as a tactile medium, according to McLuhan, and indeed to reality television as credible replacement for the reality principle, even in the politics of the West frontier empire.
Can you come to an end?
Yes, my last page. Yeah. However, the pleasure that comes from absorption in social media is more complicated than the kind that television delivers. It encourages people to associate with those who share their views, creating filter bubbles and self-reinforcing feedback loops of emotional security through the cultivation of paranoia, a familiar story which may well be seen as the crystallized second religiousness of Faustian culture. Thus, Mark Zuckerberg's belief that people ought to care more about Facebook's power to connect than about how it uses their data as a species of can be seen as a species of techno-narcissism, a Silicon Valley affliction born of hubris and missionary zeal. Its unquestioned assumption is that if people around the world use our tools and toys, their lives will instantly improve by becoming more like ours, effectively casting Facebook as a beneficent neo-colonial power, which is maybe not unlike the old missionary position of the Western Church. To conclude, especially, just a brief Spengler quote here, for we cannot look at the beautiful old handwork of a lively and primitive people without wishing to replace it by a modern technical process. They have to be wired somehow. So especially now that the digitization has overtaken the media message of analog pixels on interactive tactile screens that vividly recapture the primal somatic certainties of touch by connecting us in instant neural feedback to the digital world at our fingertips, our own physical digits at the endpoint of the Faustian etherealization of audile tactile percepts into visual tactile concepts. For the latter suggests its own flipping back into the former, just as the atomic beat of today's doomsday clock of creative destruction is but an asymptotic heightening of the creaking motion of the Faustian dynamism that entered the world stage 1,000 years ago amid fears of the end of the world on the morphological fault lines of Christendom. Thank you.